It had taken man only a few years to turn the realization of an idyllic dream, the freedom of the skies, into an instrument of death. The fighter plane was born in the First World War, in those clear skies, high above the grim struggle in the trenches below. Man learned a new way to fight. The life expectancy of a World War I fighter pilot was a chillingly brief 17 hours in the air. Today, when a fighter pilot straps himself into a cockpit, he's charged with the awesome responsibility of operating some of the most complex machinery ever devised at speeds that would outstrip a rifle bullet. This is the story of the dramatic evolution of the fighter.
Under cover of darkness, ground crews prepare their F-117A stealth fighters to lead the first attacks against Iraqi targets. It is January 17, 1991, and these black jets will unleash the first thunder of Operation Desert Storm.
I remember getting a real dry mouth crossing the border. I looked off on the right-hand side and I saw what appeared to be flares. At least that was my first impression. And I went, oh gosh, they're shooting flares. And then it took about a nanosecond later, and it was, those aren't flares, that's AAA, and they're shooting at me. And then it just opened up all around me, all over the place. I was down pretty low. I was trying to get below a weather deck to get my bombs off. And the stuff was just going off all around me. And I guess the best description to use is take the best 4th of July fireworks show you've ever seen, multiply it by 1,000 times, and that's about what it was like all around my cockpit. I don't really remember ever being afraid at that time. There was just too much happening to think about it.
The F-117's mission? Low-level precision attacks on high-priority targets inside Baghdad and other highly defended areas. Command and control centers, nuclear research facilities, fixed and mobile Scud launchers, and hardened aircraft bunkers. The F-117s attacked 37 targets on the first day of the war. Although they comprised only 2.5% of the coalition's air forces in the Gulf, they struck 31% of the first day's targets.
I thought we'd lost a couple airplanes the first night. And it was a long trip home, believe me. Coming back here, when I landed, the crew chiefs told me that everybody had returned, that all the F-117s had come back. And I didn't believe them because I just couldn't believe that anybody would have survived through all that AAA.
Reports from Iraqi troops suggest that the first indication of an attack by a stealth fighter was the explosion of its bombs on the target. Built as an attack bomber, the F-117 avoids engaging enemy fighter jets.
It is quite incapable of shooting down another airplane, and it's not intended to defend itself in the dogfighting sense. Its defense is to be invisible.
The angled facets of the jet are intended to focus and reflect incoming radar beams into a few narrow beams. The aircraft's designers found an innovative way to fly such an awkward shape.
The way they have done that is to so arrange the sharp edges between the flat surfaces that they generate vortices, they generate little eddies and currents of air, which combine together in such a way that it reproduces the lift of a normal airplane. The strange thing is that all this makes the airplane aerodynamically impossible. It's a bumblebee. It has no right to fly.
This dual-engine, single-seat fighter achieves a top speed of only Mach 0.9, less than the speed of sound. The engines are buried deep within the wing root to minimize their infrared signature.
We proved early on, when the war had not started yet, that the stealth technology worked, and we took a couple of missions up close to the border with Iraq, and there was no change in any of their activity as far as them noticing that we were up there close to their border. So we knew early on that we could get through them, and we did the first night. We've been the only ones to go downtown Baghdad. Nobody else will go. And they've asked us to do a lot of cleanup work for aircraft that couldn't get through to other targets, F-111s or F-15Es, things like that, that had a hard time getting through the defenses. I think we've had a monumental impact on this war. I think the Air Force probably wishes they had about 5 more wings of F-117s. Yeah, I wouldn't want to be in any other airplane in any other war than the F-117 right now.
What brought the Black Jet to the sands of the Persian Gulf began nearly 90 years earlier. After their historic first flight in 1903, Orville and Wilbur Wright developed their Type A flyer. With 2 counter-rotating, chain-driven propellers, the Type A flyer could carry a crew of 2 at a top speed of only 40 miles an hour. The Wrights believed in the military potential of their aircraft for long-range aerial scouting, but the Army rejected their idea, preferring to stay with observation balloons. But the idea to use airplanes as weapons received a warmer reception in Europe. The Frenchmen Henri Farman and Louis Blériot and the Brazilian Santos Dumont demonstrated the performance of their own designs and captured the imagination of European heads of state. But it wasn't until 1908 that America accepted that the airplane had a potential military role. That year, the Army Signal Corps issued specifications for a new flying machine. Quickly, the Wright brothers submitted their prototype for Army testing. Lieutenant Frank Lahm was Orville Wright's passenger.
This led to a contract in February of 1908 between the Wright brothers and the Signal Corps, in which they agreed to furnish an airplane that would fly 40 miles an hour, carry 2 persons, remain in the air for 1 hour, and, strange to relate, was to have some kind of a device by which, in case the motor stopped, it could be landed without crashing. In the summer of 1908, Orville Wright brought to Fort Myer, Virginia, the airplane that was to fulfill their specifications of the contract. Day after day, we watched him fly around and around the field in his tuning-up flight. And finally, on the 9th of September, he broke the world record by staying in the air for over 1 hour.
The military purchased the Wrights' design for $25,000, making the Type A flyer the first airplane placed in service by any government. To change course, the pilot would actually warp the fabric-covered wings through an intricate network of levers and wires. The need now was for pilots.
There in the fall of 1909, under Wilbur Wright's instruction, Lieutenant F.E. Humphreys of U.S. Engineers and myself were taught to fly, and at the end of some 3 hours were soloed and told we were pilots.
Despite repeated suggestions to expand the role of the aircraft as a weapon, the Army was vehement in limiting the new air service to reconnaissance. Pilots were instructed to carry only field glasses and cameras. Over the next few years, inventors and entrepreneurs continued refining their airplane designs with mixed results. Perhaps the most significant advancements came in engine design. The pusher motor was gradually replaced by the tractor motor, so called because it pulled the rest of the plane along with it. This gave the plane more power, speed, and what would soon prove to be its most valuable asset, maneuverability. When the First World War began, none of the airplanes crisscrossing over the trenches of the Western Front were officially intended for fighting. The pilots flew, usually unarmed, with an observer or a photographer to gather intelligence on enemy troop strength. Battlefield commanders now held accurate plots of enemy positions. The airplane quickly proved its value in war.
It became apparent early on that you could use airplanes to spot for artillery, that you could signal artillery shoots from airplanes. And it's very annoying to be shot at by artillery when somebody's doing some signaling, and so the next step is to attempt to intervene.
The machine gun transformed aircraft into deadly fighting machines. Now pilots took to the air with the expressed purpose of hunting and shooting down their enemy. The glamour and exhilaration of flight gave way to the grim reality of death in a flaming dive. The rear-mounted guns, however effective, proved difficult to keep on target during a dogfight. The best way would be if the pilots could use their airplane to aim the guns.
Now, the Dutchman Fokker, working for the Germans, worked out a system of levers and cranks and cams by which the engine fired the gun. And the gear was so arranged that the gun would only fire if the bullet was going to fly between the propeller blades. That was the real solution.
Despite warnings not to fly over Allied territory, in April 1916, a German plane was shot down, and an example of their secret weapon fell into British hands. Soon, engineers fitted Allied planes with the same type of interrupter gear. When the Americans entered the war in its third year in 1917, the Army Air Service had no fighter planes. They went to their allies, the French and the British, and flew planes of their design. The most successful fighter in Allied hands was the British Sopwith Camel. The Camel, so named because of its humpbacked appearance, destroyed no fewer than 1,294 enemy aircraft during its 16 months in action. Many German pilots favored the Fokker triplane. For the same reason, the Allies enjoyed the Sopwith. Maneuverability gave a pilot the advantage he sought in combat. The Fokker's 3 wings generated much lift, enabling it to climb higher and faster than many of its enemies. In those unfriendly skies, pilots invented and perfected tactics that would exploit the agility of their aircraft. Some pilots preferred to dive down out of the sun on their adversaries, while others would creep up from behind. A more dangerous technique was to approach an enemy head-on, pretend to climb, then at the last minute dive underneath and rake the enemy's underside with machine gun fire. The objective was simple: maneuver into firing position faster than your opponent and pump bullets into his aircraft.
In 1916, the average British fighter pilot came to the front had 2 weeks life expectancy. Well, it's pretty hard to expect that you would have a great deal of chivalry if you knew your life was on the line at the end of 2 weeks, and if you survived 2 weeks, that the only way you're going to survive was by killing the other guy. In the air, it was simply murder, and if you could murder the man faster than he could murder you, you were a successful pilot. And there was no quarter. If you could catch the enemy unawares, sneak up behind him and kill him before he was aware of it, that was ideal. And that's what the great aces tried to do. So the idea of chivalry, the Errol Flynn salute to the fallen comrade, just probably didn't exist at all.
These men invented the deadly game of aerial warfare. All other pilots played by their rules. General Benjamin Fulloy, Captain Field Kindley, Major Raoul Lufbery, Eddie Rickenbacker, and Manfred von Richthofen, the legendary Red Baron, with 80 kills to his credit. Unable to surrender their love of flight, veteran pilots thrilled audiences across the country with their barnstorming stunt shows. The 1920s and 1930s witnessed dramatic improvements in fighter design. In 1932, metal replaced fabric as the Army ordered the first all-metal monoplane fighter, the Boeing P-26 Pea-Shooter. Successful attempts at aerial refueling demonstrated that flight time was no longer limited to the size of the fuel tank. Parachutes compensated for increasing risks and became standard equipment in the 30s. But the strongest impetus for improvement came from competition. Each year at the National Air Races, fledgling designers debuted major innovations that boosted engine power, speed, or aircraft handling. Manufacturers incorporated the successful ideas into their future designs.
Air racing had always been a means of development, with the idea that you would develop engines or develop airframes. The Spitfire, for example, in World War II, is a direct result of money that was spent on the supermarine racers in the Schneider Cup period.
Following the conquest of France in 1940, Hitler devised a plan for the aerial destruction of England.
What they didn't reckon with was the fact that the British had a superior radar system, one that enabled them to economize on the use of their fighters and to place their fighters precisely where they should be in terms of a bomber attack.
Operation Sea Lion, the planned invasion of England, first required that the Luftwaffe send its fighters over the English Channel and destroy the Royal Air Force. But the British detected the incoming bomber raids with their secret coastal radar. The Spitfires knew precisely where to find the German aircraft. They also had the immense advantage of fighting over home turf. If British pilots were shot down, they would not be captured, but could be flying again within hours. The Spitfire carried 8 .30 caliber guns, 4 in each wing. What this airplane lacked in firepower compared to the 20mm cannons of Germany's Messerschmitt Me-109, it made up for in speed and maneuverability. By the end of October, after losing over 1,700 of their aircraft, the Germans canceled their invasion plans.
The Germans simply underestimated the British and they lost the Battle of Britain because of it. They came very close. Had they not had some bad leadership which caused them to switch tactics and to move targets around, they might have achieved it.
While Blitzkrieg devastated Europe, the Japanese overran all of Southeast Asia and occupied much of nationalist China. In the summer of 1941, months before the attack on Pearl Harbor would bring the United States into the war, General Claire Chennault organized a group of 100 American pilots, all volunteers, to fly P-40 Warhawks, where the Chinese agreed to pay the flyers a $500 bonus for every Japanese plane they shot down.
It wasn't the money or the bonus thing, which we didn't figure would ever be paid when we went over. We thought that was just a bunch of talk. But I think almost all of us went just because we were full of you-know-what at that young and crazy age. So I think most of us went strictly for the adventure end of it.
Fearing surprise attacks, Chennault set up an intricate web of observers and signal stations across the country to alert him and his Flying Tigers of a pending Japanese attack. Although not as agile as the lighter Japanese Mitsubishi Zeros, the P-40s were better armed than their opponents. General Chennault taught his pilots that tactics could win the fight.
He stressed the fact that the Japanese planes were much more maneuverable than the P-40, and that they could outclimb us and outturn us. So we had to use different tactics. And the idea was when we tangled with Japanese fighters, we were to try to get a shot at them and then dive away before they could turn and get on our tail. And then come back, get some altitude and come back and have another crack at them. I was right behind this twin-engine bomber and closing in from dead astern, and opened up with all my guns and at about 200 yards or so, and close to within maybe 50 yards or less. and I'm still firing, and at this point the bomber just plain blew up right in my face, and it threw my airplane up like a leaf, and out of control for a moment there. And but I can remember the feeling of exaltation of having known that no matter what happened from that point on, I had knocked down at least one.
R.T. Smith and his fellow Flying Tigers went on to knock down 295 more Japanese planes.
The Japanese always outnumbered us, and if we hadn't had the good airplane that we did in the P-40 and the training and the tactics that we'd had from Chennault, we wouldn't have done near as well as we did.
The Flying Tigers lost only 4 pilots to enemy gunfire. The work of the American Volunteer Group bought valuable time for the United States war in the Pacific. The Americans were swift to push ahead with range and firepower. The twin-tailed P-38 Lightning and the P-47 Thunderbolt were both very successful long-range fighter escorts. But the best American fighter of the war was undoubtedly found in the sleek lines of the North American P-51 Mustang.
The North American P-51 was an unusual airplane in that it was a speculative proposal by the North American company to Great Britain. Great Britain had come to them asking them to build the Curtiss P-40 fighter. North American replied that they could build a better fighter than the P-40 and deliver it within the same time frame. They rolled their airplane out in something like 100 days, and it became the best piston engine fighter of World War II by most standards.
When the Mustang entered service in Europe, it proved faster than any other fighter plane of the period. Its horsepower and streamlined airframe provided speed, but 650 caliber machine guns gave it punch.
We had a lot of latitude as to how we wanted those guns to fire, and some guys wanted those 650s to converge on a point out there the size of a 4-bit piece at 300 yards, all 6 guns passing through that same very small diameter, which gives you a tremendous impact. Other guys wanted the outside guns to reach out to 350 yards, and his middle guns at 3 1/4, and his inside guns maybe as close as 250 yards, which gave him a long cone of fire. I like to have them all passing through a little dot out there that I could barely see.
The Mustang was equally adept at ground attack missions.
When you have to attack an airfield, you're talking about attacking a fortress, because the gunners in their emplacement had nothing in the world to do but wait until they were under attack by an American force. And they would start firing when we were on the way in. And by the time we got to the point that we were shooting at airplanes on the ground, there was a curtain of fire to fly through. Some of us didn't make it.
The segregated army of the 1940s sent black pilots to an all-black unit at Tuskegee, Alabama.
The United States government decided to call it an experiment. This was a 100% black unit. Had they been half white, then they could say, well, they survived because of the whites. After the completion of the basic training, the flyers all went to Suffrage Field, Michigan. The biggest emphasis that the people who controlled Suffrage Field had was to keep the officers, flyers, blacks, out of the officers' club, and that was their main focus. They did nothing really to teach us to, or to prepare us for combat. We had to do that ourselves. But we had no one who was qualified to prepare us to face Germans, for example. We got through that, of course, and we went to combat, departing the United States on the 4th of January, 1944. We flew from eastern Italy, a place called Termoli, which before our arrival was a large wheat field. And we flew all over Central, Southern, and the near end of Eastern Europe as well. As time went by, we got better aircraft. Eventually, going through several types of aircraft, we wound up in P-51s in the 15th Air Force. It made a lot of difference in the attitude of pilots to be flying an airplane that does really produce, as opposed to some of the lesser airplanes that we had. Probably the best missions that fighter pilots have is providing cover for bombers. Anytime that we saw a bomber was in distress, some of us went down and escorted him home or escorted him back to a friendly area. But we never left them out in enemy territory alone. We never lost a bomber in that process. And no other fighter group in the world can boast the same. You know it's time to fight, and you've got to produce or die, and there's not much margin between the two, and you got a chance to find out if you had been eating meat or dog food. You don't have to tell yourself, oh, this guy's going to jab, so I'd better cover my chin. You don't have to think. You can act and react without any prior thought, and the adrenaline takes over, and you become an entirely different man than you were on the ground. There isn't anything like flying a fighter.
By war's end, P-51s had destroyed 4,950 enemy aircraft in the air, more than any other Air Corps fighter in Europe.
Yesterday, I fulfilled one of my ambitions as a combat pilot. I got one airplane.
When you come home, if you had a victory, and you can, in spite of the fact the old man made it absolutely forbidden that you do any slow rolls, things happen to you that life doesn't provide for anybody else, or even for yourself, ever. And you think that you think your hips weigh a ton, and you feel it and you believe it.
Early in 1945, Allied airmen heard a new sound in the skies over Europe. The first operational jet fighter, the German Messerschmitt 262, had entered the air war in a last-ditch effort to stop the Allied bombing raids over Germany. The first Allied flyers who reported seeing a propellerless plane were considered battle-fatigued.
The Messerschmitt jet first flew into combat against Allied bomber formations in July of 1944. But Allied experiments on jet propulsion began in the early days of 1941. Inspired by a design supplied by Great Britain, engineers at General Electric developed the first jet engine built in the United States. Mated to a Bell aircraft frame, the XP-59A made its first flight in October of 1942. Although the Aerocomet could fly about 100 miles an hour faster than a piston-powered fighter, its design was unreliable, and the first American jet never saw combat. But engine design quickly improved, and the XP-59 evolved into the P-80 Shooting Star. Although World War II ended before any P-80s reached combat, the Shooting Star became the first American jet to enter large-scale production. When the United States entered the Korean War, the Air Force had no jet fighters that could match the Russian-built MiG-15. North American aviation rushed the production of their swept-wing fighter, the F-86 Sabre, to offset the advantage being gained by the communists in the air war. The MiG-15 had 2 or 3 large-caliber cannon, capable of destroying an opposing fighter with a single good hit. but firing only 1/3 as many rounds in a given time as the 650 caliber guns on the Sabre.
Tiger lead, Tiger 2 here. I got a couple of bogeys out there with one coming around at 2 level. Roger, boy, I got it. All right, there he goes. He's going down. You got it. All right, boy, that's a good deal. Roger, we got 4 of them going in here on at 7 o'clock. Hang on. I haven't got him. Go ahead, take it, and I'll cover you. All right, I'm going in now. Okay, he's down, but you got him too.
With air combat now being fought at over 600 miles an hour, the radar-ranging gun sight of the F-86 provided a significant advantage over the MiGs.
It's somewhat sad to say that in the entire Korean War, we were only able to muster an average of about 200 F-86s in the theater at a time when there were probably 1,500 MiG-15s in the theater. The F-86 was a much better gun platform, much more stable than the MiG. The MiG tended to have difficulty at high altitudes and difficulty in tracking its weapons. But the big thing was aggressiveness. The American pilots were over there. They're anxious to get into combat. The MiG pilots were pretty much under ground control. They could only enter combat when they were told to do so, and that saps initiative. So there was a big difference in the quality of the pilots and the quality of the training.
By the end of the war, Sabre pilots had shot down 792 MiGs at a loss of only 76 Sabres, a victory ratio of 10-1. Although the McDonnell Douglas F-4 Phantom became the MiG killer of Vietnam, it was conceived in the late 1950s as a high-altitude interceptor, armed with missiles, but no rapid-fire gun. The early F-4s were designed to encounter and destroy high-flying Soviet bombers and their escorts from great distances. The air war in Vietnam did not become a push-button war. Instead, and unexpectedly, individual air combat in Southeast Asia developed along the lines of the dogfights of World War I, with victory going to the pilot who made the best use of his aircraft and weapons. On August 28, 1972, while flying top cover for attack aircraft, Captain Steve Ritchie fired a missile at a MiG-21 and raised his tally of enemy kills to 5. That engagement made Captain Ritchie the Air Force's first pilot ace of the war. He described the encounter at his home base in Thailand.
They were quite a bit higher than we were, and Chuck followed them right down the radar, and I began to make a stern conversion, what we call it, when they got in close. Picked them up high at 11 o'clock on almost a head-on pass, and from there maneuvered into 6 o'clock and fired a few missiles and was lucky enough to get a kill. The job wasn't over then. We were still in a pretty hostile area, and I knew there was another MiG behind us, and so we had to get the rest of the force home, and of course our 4 airplanes, and again there was a possibility of another MiG engagement and some pretty heavy defense on the way out, and fuel's always a consideration, so there was a lot to do.
It didn't achieve the victory ratio that was achieved in the Korean War because things had vastly changed. The communists fought a much smarter war. There were far fewer engagements, but it did so many things so well, and more than anything else, it was rugged.
Victory in the Gulf War rested heavily with multi-role aircraft like the F-15 Eagle. The Eagle is considered one of the most versatile and effective air superiority fighters in history. First flown in the early 1970s, the F-15 was the first U.S. fighter to have engine thrust greater than the normal weight of the aircraft, allowing it to accelerate while in a vertical climb. The plane was designed to take everything that had been learned in air-to-air combat in Vietnam and mate it with the best that modern technology had to offer. With 8 missiles, a gun, and advanced avionics, the F-15 Eagle proved its worth within the early hours of Desert Storm.
Flying F-15s over Iraq. We're based in Dhahran. And we've been flying primarily defensive counter-air missions over Saudi Arabia. When the war broke out on the 17th of January, our mission changed significantly. Since that time, we've basically had a threefold mission. Obviously, still maintaining the defensive counter-air to protect the high-value assets, the AWACS and the tankers, the rivet joints, the jammers. Additionally, we have OCA pre-strike sweep and escort missions where we're tied with a package. Primarily the packages that can't support themselves, like the F-111s, F-4Gs, EF-111s. Additionally, several F-16 packages where we escort in front, sweep for MiGs, set up caps, and cover the regress, and then protect them on the way back. And the third leg of our mission is what we did today. Today has been a MiG sweep. We've taken off, gone to the central region of Saudi Arabia, and we're basically tied to nobody. We go straight up into Iraq and sweep the airfields, utilizing minimum communication so as to not reveal our position, and sweep for any fighter activity or helicopter activity for that matter. The emphasis primarily has been on the eastern border to prevent the Iraqis from escaping into Iran. But additionally, we sweep west, north, and south as well. Today, we started from the central, swept up toward Baghdad, hung a right to the east, looked at several airfields in the southeastern and eastern sector, ran the Iranian border, repeated that a couple of times, and then came back to Saudi Arabia to refuel.
The F-15 faced a formidable rival, the MiG-29.
One of the major differences between the MiG-29 and the F-15, and I think this goes for most Soviet and American fighters, is the engine technology. The Soviets traditionally have not been able to produce as much power or as much fuel efficiency or as much durability, strength in their engines as the Americans. And when you're trying to achieve something with a poorer engine, you can't come up with superior performance.
Though not up to the latest Western standards, the MiG-29 represents a new and capable generation of Soviet fighters. Fighting with the coalition, European air forces demonstrated the strengths of their own aircraft. Vertical takeoff and landing made the British Harrier a perfect choice to fly close air support missions for ground troops. The jump jet can operate from battered runways where conventional jets cannot land. The Tornado, an attack fighter designed by Germany, Britain, and Italy, has been made stealthy with the addition of radar-absorbing material around the engine intakes. But the premier attack fighter of the war was the F-16. After Operation Desert Storm began on January 17, 1991, F-16 Fighting Falcons flew thousands of sorties against targets in Iraq and Kuwait. Most of these sorties were flown against ground targets, as resistance from the Iraqi Air Force during the war was negligible.
The role of the F-16 is to fill the gaps behind the F-15. The F-16 protects the home sky and can take all the other jobs that the F-15 is too busy to do.
The F-16 is a single-seat, single-engine aircraft. It has a blended wing body design in which the fuselage contributes lift. Its control surfaces are entirely fly-by-wire, meaning that the work once done by hydraulics is now done by a computerized network of electric motors, hence its nickname, the electric jet. The F-16 displayed with great success its ability to swing from the role of air-to-air fighter to attack bomber. Only 5 F-16s were lost in combat during the 7-week war. Not only is technology changing the look of fighter aircraft, it is also amending the traditional role of the fighter.
The ATF, the Advanced Tactical Fighter, has a quite distinct mission to perform. Its primary mission is to fly into enemy territory and knock down anything enemy that's flying there before it can come across and make trouble on our side of the lines. It has to appear very rapidly on the scene. That means supersonic approach. It means able to deliver its weapons in supersonic speed, and it means it's got to be able to maneuver against fighters without losing supersonic speed. It makes a distinct trade-off between being invisible on radar like the F-117 is, to being hard to see in order to get closer in and to get a shot at the enemy with its missile before the enemy can get a shot with the enemy missile back.
The ATF may be the most maneuverable modern plane built, thanks in part to nozzles that direct the engine exhaust. Thrust vectoring helps push the plane through sharp turns at very high speeds, enabling the pilot to direct its weapons from almost any position. The real task of the fighter pilot is to strike rapidly, using every advantage to ensure surprise.
What started as a frail curiosity of wood and fabric has evolved into a tightly knit package of metal and power. Today's fighter can strike an enemy half a world away at 1,000 miles an hour. But as different as today's jet fighter is from the Wright brothers' flying machine of 1909, the pilots from those two distant eras could be interchangeable. They share identical qualities: courage, tenacity, and the cavalier spirit that makes a pilot, a fighter pilot.